Now let's move on to our top story. And Russian mercenaries from the country's notorious Wagner group have vowed to take revenge after their leader was reportedly killed in a plane crash over Moscow. Yevgeny Prigozhin was thought to be on board the private jet after it crashed yesterday, wiping out 10 members of Wagner's leadership team.
Now, while Putin's regime has so far refused to accept responsibility, Russian security forces have been put on alert following the Wagner threats to march on the Kremlin. The crash comes just 2 months after the mercenary boss, who was a former close ally of the Russian leader, led a failed mutiny on Moscow in June.
Well, joining us now is Cormac Smith, who's a former advisor to Ukraine's foreign ministry.
And down the line from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, is British journalist John Sweeney. I'm going to come to you first, Cormac. This is not the first time that Prigozhin has been presumed dead after a plane crash, is it?
No, I believe it's not. In this case, I think there's still a doubt. We still need to have it confirmed that he is indeed dead, but certainly the consensus of opinion is gathering that indeed he is dead and that Putin was either directly or indirectly involved for it. But I think we must stress, and I think John would also stress when he comes in, that we don't actually know yet. And there is so much disinformation and deception comes out of Russia that we have to be very careful.
Of course. And it's an intriguing story on so many levels. You and I have spoken at length, actually, about what's going on in Ukraine. We talked about the Wagner group before. But obviously, he led this insurgency, this march onto Moscow, exactly to the day 2 months, which I think is interesting in itself. But also, given that, he then stepped down. He then was going to face sanctions from the Russian president. Then all charges were dropped. There was a deal brokered by the Belarusian president, and as a result of that, those charges were then dropped. He then appeared back in Russia. He's been in Africa. It appears that he then came back only, yesterday, and this happens. It's not a coincidence, is it?
It's not a coincidence. I personally was always very, very suspicious about the circumstances in which the so-called attempted coup ended, because it was very, very clear that there were little or no sanctions on Prigozhin and he was free to move freely in and out of Belarus. But I think what we're probably seeing is that revenge is a dish best served cold. And we know that Vladimir Putin has form on this for many, many years. And, you know, his fate was probably sealed at the end of that attempted coup.
I just wanted to bring John in, who's down the line. Are you there, John? Hi. We've just had news that Putin has actually sent condolences to Prigozhin's family. Well, there we go. Your reaction says it all, John. What's your take on that?
Oh, so the crocodile tears are now falling. I mean, like everybody else, I believe absolutely that this has got Vladimir Putin's handiwork all over it, and there is good evidence that you can actually see the contrails of surface-to-air missiles taking out Prigozhin's jet. And by the way, the Wagner people around him are saying he's dead. And I think, yes, the thing about Prigozhin, he's like a zombie. You want to make bloody sure that he's in his coffin and it's him in the coffin. However, I think he is dead, and I think Putin did it. And actually, Putin's in trouble now because I think he's lost the oligarchs. I think he's lost middle-class Russia, but they don't want to oppose him because they're obviously afraid. Who wouldn't be? But he's always had the right and the far right. That's his nationalist constituency. They're the people who've always backed Putin. And Prigozhin, over the last year or so, has slowly eaten away or taken people away from Putin to Prigozhin. And to understand his kind of strange mercenary army, it's not just a mercenary army. It was a bit of a cult that Prigozhin had. He was very popular with Russian working class. He was an oligarch. He was a filthy rich convict. Absolutely no question about that. But he spoke like an ordinary Russian, and he went to the front line on several occasions, and he was personally brave, a horrible human being and a war criminal. But the thing about Prigozhin was he had some appeal. And now He's dead in this is a very, very, very public execution by the Russian state. And so the question, what I'm fascinated to see is, will Mr. Crocodile, will Vladimir Putin go to the funeral? Because there will be people at that funeral who will be very angry, and they're used to killing people, and they're used to carrying guns. So, I mean, the mood, I can't express, and this sounds dark, but remember, the Wagner army are very brutal and pitiless things. So the number of people who are cracking jokes about Prigozhin, it's just through the roof here in Kyiv. And there is this sense that this is trouble for Putin, and how he deals with it is going to be, it's a dark game. It's like Game of Thrones is the magic roundabout to compare to the Kremlin Game of Thrones. How is he going to play it? We'll see.
We will indeed see. I saw you nodding along there, Cormac. You know, John was just saying there that basically it's a dark day indeed. I wonder what it does for Putin standing within Russia, and indeed what it means for national security and international security. Also, just in terms of the Wagner Group, what I find extraordinary is Prigozhin, of course, was not a trained soldier, was he? He was a convict. He was a criminal. He was a chef to Putin. He then had this mercenary army, which not only had dealings in Russia and Ukraine, also in Africa, essentially looting and causing chaos.
He was originally a hot dog seller, I believe.
He was. Well, he was originally a convict. He was then selling hot dogs on a street corner in St. Petersburg. And story has it that a chance meeting with Vladimir Putin, they started to do some business together, and that's where, in the catering world, and that's where he got the name Putin Chef. But I'd like to add one thing to what John has said. I agree with John that I think this is very bad news in the long run for Putin. But the other area I think it's bad news, as vile an individual as Prigozhin was, and as evil as the Wagner army were, responsible for some of the most despicable atrocities and war crimes across Ukraine, but also across many, many African communities. They were, despite all this, they were among the most potent fighting force in the Russian army. Now, I spoke to a very, very good friend, but back at the start of the summer, a senior Ukrainian diplomat, when I was writing a piece about the battle for Bakhmut, and I said, why does Ukraine not withdraw? And the message I got was very, very clearly, we know what we're doing, man. We are bleeding out Wagner. Now, even the American intelligence services have estimated that Wagner took over 100,000 casualties in the battle for Bakhmut. And generally, you know, the Ukrainians were at one stage estimating they were killing at a rate of 7 to 1. The Brits and the Americans, we tend to be a little bit more conservative. So I think what this has also done is it has taken out a very potent fighting force. Now, the same the same food for the meat grinder will still be available, and they will be recruited, no doubt, into other private military companies. But Prigozhin, I believe, was actually a very, very effective leader of the Wagner Group. And without him, Wagner is no more.
Let's just put that to John as well. What happens in terms of a power vacuum? So obviously Prigozhin, but also Dmitry Utkin, who also founded the Wagner Group as well. He's believed to have died in that as well. What happens now? Is there a power vacuum, and what fills it?
Well, bloody good question. Utkin, by the way, had 2 SS flashes on his clavicles here. So when people say, entirely wrongly, that the Ukrainians are a bit Nazi, these people really were Nazis. The best way of thinking about them is it's kind of like the SS for Nazi Germany. And that they were, Cormac's exactly right, he's bang on the money. The Wagner Group was an effective and terrifying fighting force, and Ukrainian soldiers I know have told me that. So with the Messiah, if you like, or the Himmler of the SS dead, executed by the Russian state, we all believe, then there is a hole inside the Russian killing machine. Its most ferocious, most feared unit has now lost not only its charismatic commander-in-chief, Prigozhin, but also the guy who actually ran the thing on a day-to-day basis, Ukin, as you properly said. So Putin's got a problem. He's lost his most terrifying soldiers, and he's angered the far-right nutcases who really, really loved Prigozhin. And so the question is, now these people, they're not afraid to kill people. Will they turn their guns on the Kremlin?
Yeah.
Watch this space.
Indeed.
Cormac, can I just ask, how big is the Wagner Group estimated?
Well, I can't answer that question.
No.
I don't know. But as I said, we can have
Can
an idea.
anyone?
Can anybody know?
Can anyone?
John might be able to enlighten us. He's closer to it than me, but I simply can't give you a accurate
And
estimate.
is that because it's so murky, we actually don't know what's going on?
Well, look, what I would say is Wagner was formed around 2013. They first came to light with the illegal annexation of Crimea. They were famously the little green men without insignia. But really, I was hearing a lot about them from 2016 when I was working at the heart of the Ukrainian government for 2 years. But we weren't really hearing a lot about them in the West. They existed in many countries, not just Ukraine, but across African countries where they are very active, to provide plausible deniability for the Kremlin. That shroud has now fallen away. That plausible deniability doesn't exist anymore. But that's what they existed for. So they have been they've been very murky. I certainly couldn't put a honest estimate on how big they were. But if you go back to the figure that they took 100,000 casualties in the battle for Bakhmut alone, it suggests they were pretty big. But over to John on that one.
Yeah, John, can you have an answer at that question?
So they're a plastic bag. And at one point they had an awful lot, in particular, of convicts. A lot of those people were killed by the Ukrainians. And now I would say there's a rump of something like less than 10,000. But that's a terrifying 10,000. And right now they're angry because their beloved Messiah is dead.
Yep.
And the people they blame, as everybody in the West thinks, is Vladimir Putin. So this, for me, is Vladimir Putin's grip on power is in serious trouble. It was when the Prigozhin mutiny was taking place. Now that he's been executed in this very public, fireball, now he's been executed. Will Prigozhin exact revenge on the man who's now crying crocodile tears for the man he's had murdered?
And also, just in terms of that, I mean, it was, as you say, brazen in the middle of the day for the whole world to see exactly what happened, which shows the state, the mental state of Putin, because he was there and he was determined to show the world a signal about himself being in charge of Mother Russia. But also, it seems he has increasingly erratic behaviour. There's a lot of talk about him also being very unwell, having a terminal illness, which will embolden him. What do you know of that?
Well, so I've written about this a bit in my book, Killer in the Kremlin. But by the way, the other day, Putin is on the telly and he looks at his watch and then he realizes his watch is on the wrong wrist. And this is the man we all think is his double. Now, his double, a lot of the time, I think we're looking at the real Putin. I've written about the health scares, but it feels like, and the CIA seems to be saying this, that Putin has, whatever was wrong with him, he's got fixed. So there is, but you see the Putin here, this guy who's shaking all these hands, I'm suspicious I'm suspicious, I think that is the double. This man here, when he's miles away from people, I think that's the real Putin, because he's physically afraid after COVID of going anywhere near people. When you see Putin mucking around with the wrist, his watch being on the wrong wrist, when you see him with lots of people, I think that's the double.
That is Putin, a stunning disclosure.
Yeah, I mean, you watch it, it's peculiar. But the thing about Putin is he's got a track record for killing his enemies in a spectacular way. Litvinenko was killed with a weapon of mass destruction, Polonium 210, on the streets of London. Skripal was killed with a weapon of mass destruction, Novichok. Oh, sorry, they tried to kill him. They didn't kill him. They actually ended up killing this entirely innocent Wiltshire lass, Dawn Sturgis, God bless her soul. But what you've got here is a history of Vladimir Putin taking out people he hates in a kind of Hollywood spectacular way. And that is why I'm confident he had Prigozhin murdered. The question is, will the people who fought in the Wagner army, who loved Prigozhin as some kind of weird culty messiah, will they have their revenge on the man they think murdered him?
And that is the million-dollar question. Thank you so much to Cormac Smith and also to John Sweeney.